if something's happening to your company and it is truly seismic and there is a larger force, you don't have a lot of control of really the force itself, but you have complete control over what you do. So, if you're a pharmaceutical and machine learning is, on the horizon, you can ignore it or you can incorporate it. And so the question becomes, how do you organize around machine learning to improve dosage or identify therapy, process or protocol or whatever you're using machine learning for? It's what you do in response to the force that matters.
Welcome to the Conversation Factory. I'm your host, Daniel Stillman. Each episode, I'll talk to an amazing conversation designer to try and distill insights we can all bring into our work and lives. Human conversation is a material that can be shaped by design, and shifting conversations in everyday meetings, in organizations, and yourself can create real change. And I hope to help you do it better and more authentically. I'd love to have you stay part of the conversation. Head over to theconversationfactory.com to sign up for my newsletter and never miss an episode. That's theconversationfactory.com. I'd also love for you to be part of the show. If there's a challenging transformation you're working through, head over to theconversationfactory.com, click coaching, and sign up for 30 minutes of free coaching that I might use on the show. Head over to theconversationfactory.com, hit coaching, and let me know what conversations you need help redesigning. Enjoy the episode. Today I talk with Luminary Labs CEO and founder, Sara Holoubek. Luminary Labs is a really unique company that both consults with companies on strategy and also helps run massive open innovation programs for organizations. Today, we talk about working on problems that matter, on how humans have always been more nuanced than marketers, and how companies need to be creating intelligence engines. One of the things that Sara helped me think about is an idea I've been noodling with about complementarity versus non-complementarity. How in situations you really only have these two choices, to go with or against the current tide. Sara helped me see that the conversation between a company and the culture it's in is very similar to the conversation two people might have. Companies face that choice too. Only too many companies choose to go along with trends or not. Not intentionally, but mostly unintentionally. And that's the thing about design. Everything is designed either well or poorly, intentionally or unintentionally. Sara helps companies and the people in them be more intentional about their work. In trying to redesign a conversation you're in, you can shift patterns by consciously pushing with or against them. David Bohm tells a great story about this in his book On Dialogue. A psychologist was treating a young girl who wouldn't talk to anybody. After an hour of fruitless attempts, he was exasperated and said, "Why won't you talk to me?" "Because I hate you," she countered. She was pushing back on his energy, see? So he asked, "How long will you hate me?" She said, "I'll hate you forever." But then he kept with it, taking the logic further. "How long will you hate me forever?" Somehow, this broke the spell, and the little girl laughed. He kept questioning her refusal. Somehow taking it seriously helped shift it. What is that behavior? He somehow accepted what was happening with the little girl, but questioning it in the right way shifted the conversation. I learned about non-complementarity from Invisibilia, an awesome podcast on NPR. I'll link the episode in the notes. In the show opening, they talk about a group of people drinking wine in their backyard who get held up at gunpoint. They tell the robber they have nothing, so they offer him a glass of wine instead, which flips the whole script of getting robbed. Spoiler alert, it ends in a group hug. Enjoy that episode from Invisibilia, and enjoy this episode too. I hope you learn something about redesigning conversations in your own context. Sara Holoubek, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. You are the CEO and founder of Luminary Labs. and you guys help organizations transform themselves from the inside out and also from the outside in. The first question I wanted to ask you about was an article you wrote about toothpaste in regards to making sure that we're solving problems that matter. And I just think that's a really important idea these days. Can you tell me a little bit about that shift for you between getting pulled closer and closer to problems that you were more passionate about?
Sure. So I spent the first part of my career in what I would call the early internet. And so I was in business school in France in the late 90s, and I was very interested in understanding consumers, people, real people, what they thought and felt, and very intrigued by this idea that there was a science behind what we liked and this conversation between brands and people. So at the time, I really wanted to work in the field of branding. And a friend of mine who had gone to the same business school said, "You don't want to do that, Sarah. You want to work in the internet." And I was like, what does that mean to work in the internet? And again, this is like 1998, 1999. And so upon graduation, I returned from France to the United States and headed to New York, where at that time, if you had a pulse, they were like, "Come work for our internet company." And so they were everywhere. And you probably remember, Cosmo and, the Globe and many of those early digital companies. And so I went to work for a company called Organic. It was one of the first digital agencies. Today, that's a very known thing. We know what a digital agency looks like. But in 1998, 1999, it was an exercise in inventing everything. So I was in the strategy group. I was an analyst, and we were trying to understand how companies should or should not go online. So when we think about online banking, nearly everybody does some form of online banking today. But back then, nobody really did this online, and we were trying to understand, what type of person would do this online. And keep in mind, very few people had broadband. You had broadband at work. At home, you were still using a dial-up. And so over the years, the excitement of always doing the new thing, it was constantly fresh. At first it was, how do we connect with people through the internet? Later it was, how do we advertise to people through the internet? And it became more social. How do we engage with people through the internet? How does search help us understand what real people want and need? And that fueled me for so many years. I felt like I was at the forefront of something. But then I hit a point where I realized that, like, when search, was over and it flipped over to video or social, and not that the job is done in any of these spaces, but I was really sort of peddling the same thing over and over again. It was less about the technology. And I'm not a technologist by trade. I'm not a coder. I'm not a designer. I'm a strategist. And I realized that I was being asked to take everything I learned about radically transforming industries, and I think the pinnacle was having worked with a major real estate company. Well, it was the largest in the United States at the time, to radically revamp how people searched and bought homes. At the time, nobody was doing this online, and realtors were very much against the internet because it meant you couldn't keep people in your car as you drove them around to see homes. To reshape that industry and help a very large organization help its realtors understand that people would actually spend more money and spend less time buying the home, and that would be a good thing for everybody, was incredible. We were like, wow, we did this. We completely changed how people do this online. And then the next account that came along was a toothpaste account. And while brushing your teeth is very important, and I don't mean to make light of it, I mean, to be really serious, early childhood cavities are actually a major problem that needs to be addressed. The problem I was being asked to look at was I think the toothpaste had like a new stripe, and the stripe had a sparkle in it. And I was like, oh my goodness, really? Like, I have to work on this?
But sparkle, Sarah. They were sparkly.
Sparkle. And I mean, listen, there are a lot of people who love to do this, and it makes the music sing inside of them, and they should do that. But it wasn't right for me. And so that sort of led me down this path of wondering, is there something else I should do? And so for a period of time, I every time I was job hunting, I'd always look at something in digital, and then I'd always look at a nonprofit job, and I would apply for both. And I kept doing the digital thing um, until probably about like 10 years ago, when a little bit over 10 years ago, when I was an independent consultant and a healthcare company called me. And I was like, wow, I'm supposed to use everything I know to help a pharmaceutical. This could go really, really well. This could go really, really poorly. And I was characterizing pharma because I didn't actually know a lot about pharma. And, long story short, it was the best thing I ever did.
Mm. It's so interesting because you're almost talking about like the Gartner hype cycle, where when you get past the complex region, it's less interesting to you. You really want to be in that part where there's more chaos, but also more opportunity to make a real impact.
Yes, I think that's potentially true, because in those early days you get to experiment and stretch things. I would argue that marketers are usually the first to glom onto new technology, and while that's really great, it's also a source of frustration for me when the very same technologies can be used to improve life for the billions on this planet. So, when we think about everything from search and social to smartphones to the blockchain, our minds immediately go to how can we create commercial value, which is not a bad thing, and we should absolutely do that. But we completely forget, and when I say we, I mean the people who actually work with the technology, corporations, investors, we completely forget where very big opportunities are to ensure a more equitable future.
I want to tease something out because I'm just going to guess, because I feel this way, and maybe you feel this way too, that the real estate versus the toothpaste problem, again, not denigrating toothpaste whatsoever, is this idea of creating lasting change and a change of a certain scale. And I'm wondering if your interest in helping companies operationalize innovation comes from that same place in you, where helping a company innovate in an incremental way or innovate once is not as satisfying as helping them create a lasting change inside of their organization that allows them to continue to do that.
Yeah, I think it's very intentional that we state that part of our mission is to transform not just organizations, but industries at large. Mm. So, a really great program might yield a good result for right now, but a true innovation system creates a longer-term advantage or has a longer-term effect. So, again, I'm less interested in, the Ad of the Year award and more interested in, how can we rethink what we do. And it can be incremental. I'm not opposed to incremental innovation. I think there are places in time where that's actually important and maybe the best way to do things. But it really comes down to, is it lasting, right? And again, it could be at scale. It could not be at scale. It just depends upon the problem. But is it a lasting thing? Is it something that, we will in 20 years or 50 years say, wow, do you remember when? So, one of the examples I give right now is, there was a time when you would buy your airplane ticket and it would be mailed to you on that piece of paper.
Yeah.
And it didn't even have to be you. You could buy tickets from a friend and the name didn't have to match the messenger. And so for a lot of different reasons that has changed, everything from Homeland Security to, e-ticketing. Mm. So, how we organize, what happened to the travel agent. And that would be a really good example of an entire industry that has completely changed how they book flights and how they create their revenue streams. I think they're undergoing another round right now where, we also say, remember when you used to get a meal and the meal actually had real silverware? Mm. And, now we're looking at, how many people can we pack into into this airplane and, could they be even closer? And, Could there be, the low cost option in the back, and you pay more for every additional thing you get to do? So it is absolutely, not only something of permanence, but to your point about conversations and organizations of conversations, like they do ebb and flow and evolve with time.
They sure do, and it seems like there's also like certain assumptions that shift, that change how people expect that they're supposed to be acting. Right? I think at some point, everyone was like, "Oh yeah, no free bags," and everyone was like, "Now we just sort of accept that," which is shocking in some ways.
Yeah, I think it's always helpful to look at the forces that affect any industry, and we very specifically talk about technological, economic, political, and social norms of the 21st century. That's the time in which we operate right now as a company. And while many of our clients will call us because there's a technological problem, they're having trouble adapt to some new tech norm, whether it's usage by consumers or it's something that they're doing internally or it's the potential of the technology to transform their industry. Ultimately, we find that economic forces, political forces, or social forces are also shifting how they do business. And so it would be silly to say that like tech lives outside of the society in which it operates, right?
No, of course.
So as we introduce new technologies, expectations of people, expectations of employees, expectations of investors also change.
Now, some of those forces are within your scope of influence, and some of them aren't. So, when a company is starting to look at all of these forces, how do you get them to grapple with separating or teasing out these different forces and making them actionable?
Well, I would argue that if something's happening to your company and it is truly seismic and there is a larger force, you don't have a lot of control of really the force itself, but you have complete control over what you do. So, if you're a pharmaceutical and machine learning is, on the horizon, you can ignore it or you can incorporate it. And so the question becomes, how do you organize around machine learning to improve dosage or identify therapy, process or protocol or whatever you're using machine learning for? It's what you do in response to the force that matters, right? So social norms are classic. I mean, when the internet came of age and we realized like everybody's doing this at home. There's a time when executives would say, "But do real people do this?" And you say, "Well, do you go home and use YouTube?" And they're like, "Well, actually, I do." And then it comes back to, like, I'll never forget this conversation with an executive in a franchise within a pharmaceutical. He was in the cancer franchise, and it was totally lost on him that real people might actually go to YouTube to learn more about cancer. It didn't feel serious to him. And, Yahoo Answers, say, well, the real people are actually asking questions that probably should go to their doctor. And so rather than poo-poo it or say that it is not serious, you should ask yourself, why? Why are real people trusting the internet when they're not, asking the same questions of medical professionals, or are they asking questions of both and looking at the responses? And I think today we've kind of crossed that line where it's like, okay, yes, real people do use the internet for almost everything, and in fact, it's probably the first place they go.
It's fascinating, Sarah. Like, I feel like you have the strategist's true love of human behavior, like the asking the why, like not judging it, just saying, isn't it amazing that people are acting this way?
Yeah, I mean, everything is human-driven. I recently decided I was no longer going to describe companies as data-driven or tech-driven, because ultimately there has to be a human somewhere that, even if you're just flipping the switch. And, we can say, well, you could build a machine that flips the switch, but then somebody has to build a machine. And,
yes.
I don't think we'll ever extract humans completely. And I think it's, Well, there is the real fear of how technology will change our jobs and our livelihoods that has always existed. We've always been afraid of the new technology. And I think it is a complete error to assume that humans don't have a role. Our role will change, but it will hopefully bring out what humans are best at. And there's something like delightful and wonderful about humans that can never
I'm
be
glad you still think
replaced.
so. That's good.
Yeah,
I hope we never lose that.
Yeah, yeah. It's one of the biggest fallacies right now is that everything is all about the tech and forget people and that's very fundamental to how we guide our clients in their work. But also in how we think about how businesses organize and operate overall.
Yeah.
If you forget humanity, I don't know what you're doing on planet Earth.
Yeah. So I definitely want to talk to you about the Human Company Playbook and some stuff on your book club list. But first I want to just go back a couple of beats. There was a couple of things you said that I just really want to capture. You talked about the ebb and flow of conversation, and I'm wondering about the ebb and flow of the conversation between brands and people and how that relates to a company's innovation. Like, how are they pulling those messages in or rejecting them?
Wow, you might have exceeded my pay grade here. Well, I absolutely love talking about consumer behavior. I've been a little bit outside of the advertising and sort of communication space for a while. But if I were to sort of posit something, first and foremost, you have to provide a service, like a good service or product. Like people have to like the thing. But I think what has been interesting in more recent years is that the thing is actually not enough. It's almost as if everything is a commodity and it's these other layers on top of the thing. So you like the jacket, but does the jacket support the causes you care about? Does the jacket represent your values? Does the medium through which the jacket talks to you, is it cool enough? Or is it trying too hard? And I think this is definitely something many people have produced many, many studies about this, that, millennials have a very different approach to deciding how they engage with brands. What do they buy? What do they not buy? And, I think where it gets most interesting is this high-low combination where people are comfortable mixing high-end and low-end products. So you might buy a luxury jacket and then the jeans were, from Target or something like that or whatever. And it was confusing for the traditional marketer, right? Because we used to focus only on demographics. And then I think when the internet came around, I remember as an analyst, it was all about demographics, technographics, and psychographics, right? And we would look at audiences through those three lenses. And today, like the psychographic part is just off the charts, right? So people are no longer uniform. We think about people as lookalikes. So when you think about Amazon's recommendation engine or Netflix's recommendation engine, collaborative filtering has yielded that like people might look alike in some areas, but not in other areas. So our historic approach to grouping people no longer stands. We can no longer blank, like with the internet in particular, because everybody can consume everything now. It doesn't matter where you live, and it doesn't matter how much money you make, and it doesn't matter all the basic household income or family size, things that used to dictate what your family would buy or what they would be interested in. Through the internet, we're now able to say like, wow, you like period pieces with a strong female lead, but you also like thrillers,
Yeah.
So, it's more nuanced. I think humans have probably always been more nuanced. I think marketers have been less nuanced in the past. So I think that's probably what has changed in my mind.
So we're just now sort of waking up to the complexity of humans, and it's up to a company to reckon with that somehow.
Yeah, another really great example was when I first started working with healthcare and pharma. It was completely inappropriate to interject humor into any conversation with patients because disease is not funny. But if you actually talk to people living with any disease, humor almost always comes up. And so there's this big disconnect between what is perceived to be appropriate and what is actually helpful. And it's a fine line. I'm not saying it's easy. But humans are nuanced. You can live with diabetes or live with cancer and have a sense of humor about it. Many people will tell you that that's the only way they can get by is to have a sense of humor about it. But learning how to authentically have the humor there is hard, right? So it would probably be inappropriate for the pharmaceutical company to make the joke, but to appreciate that real people are making the joke and acknowledging that the joke exists, it would be a really great way to better understand humans and the humans who are living with a disease or benefiting from your therapy.
Yeah, yeah. And it seems like there's that line, and it's up to a company to sort of say, is this the moment to transform that conversation, to bring the humor in? Are people ready for it? Versus maybe going a little too far. And it's a subtle line.
I think there's a way to honor the nuances in humans without trying to replicate it, right? And so, we always know when a brand is trying too hard, right? You're like, I kind of see what you're trying to go for, not really working for me. I think we see that with products that are marketed to women or moms, and you're like, okay, I totally get it. You really want women to buy this. It didn't really need to be pink. Or, the ads that make dad look like a helpless, bumbling fool. Like, not really authentic. And while there might be jokes here and there, and sometimes it might be true in individual situations, it's actually a disservice. And that's why those don't work so well.
So how can a company act more human? Because we know the human's sort of pushing it a little too much, right? And we need to pull it back.
Yeah, I think instead of acting human, just listen to humans and create mechanisms. I talk about creating intelligence engines. So anytime you're doing anything that touches a consumer with today's technology, you can learn a lot, right? So all the data that we have access to, all of the insights that we can gather, what do you use them for? Just to create the better ad, or do you actually use it to inform everything you do? And so, oftentimes we'll find that the stuff sits only in marketing, and in fact, some of that intelligence is best shared with product development or shared with maybe operations or finance, right? So how might they respond? What would they do differently if they knew how real humans behaved? And so that would be one way of being human. If you'd like to get into on the bigger picture, human company design, customers are absolutely part of being human. So acknowledging that part of your reason to exist is to produce something for a customer. I think what has happened in more recent years, probably the last 30 to 40 years, starting, I guess, in the 70s, we decided that corporations exist to create shareholder value. And this is a very documented shift. Economists and authors have written about this extensively. But prior to the 70s, there was a big debate about whether the purpose of a corporation was to create shareholder value or not. And we chose shareholder value. Unfortunately, we chose exclusively shareholder value. And so when push comes to shove, the decisions, especially of public companies, really foster shareholder value over the customer, over their employees, over society at large. And I think this is a massive problem throughout all of corporate America and even beyond the United States, as some of our recent research has suggested. And we've completely forgotten that value can be created by investing in people and not just extracting from people.
Hey, this is Daniel. We're at about the halfway point, so this is a great time for you to get up, stretch your legs, get some popcorn, fill up your soda. If you're in the car, stay focused. If you have your hands free, this is also a great moment to head over to theconversationfactory.com to sign up for the newsletter. I send out more detailed write-ups, insights, and tools from these conversations, and I'd love to share them with you. So head over to theconversationfactory.com and stay in the loop.
So we define human company design as a management approach that creates value by investing in people. And so that's the antithesis of, right, so it's the antithesis of extracting from people. So when you think about wage labor, it's an extraction. You do this for me, and I will give you money, right? So I'm not actually investing in you. I'm just exchanging money for the thing you gave me. And what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years has been this sea change of organizations that are suggesting that they might actually create longer value, and especially over the long run, greater value over the long run, by investing in people. And this means investing in their employees, but also beyond that. It means investing in communities. It means investing in customers. It means investing in anybody who is a human, ultimately shareholders as well, but not putting shareholders first, which is what most companies do.
Yeah, this is fascinating because one of the questions I wanted to ask you was there's a Peter Drucker quote in one of your presentations about a company's primary responsibility is to serve its customers. That profit is not the primary goal, but it's a condition for the company's continued existence and sustainability. And what's interesting is the flip side of that is, like, I'm always a fan of Danny Meyer's employee first, because his theory is if you take care of the employees, everything else will be taken care of. And what I'm hearing you say is that it's a false dichotomy. You have to invest in
Well, I
people.
think, yeah, I'd be really curious to know what Drucker would say if he were alive today. Again, going back to conversations that ebb and flow, I think his argument was part of this conversation with Milton Friedman, right, who really did push, profit is the only responsibility. I think he at one point said it was the only social responsibility, and like anything else would be unadulterated socialism.
Right. Yes.
And so, right, and so Drucker's like, well, no, that's not really why we create profit. And there are really opposing views on like why do you start a business, why do you take a business public, why do you what do you do with your profit? And I think the reason we sort of really embrace the investing in people and defining people more broadly is that we through our work see really big problems affecting the world. When I talk about chronic disease, and let's just take diabetes with, 27, 28, 29 million people living with diabetes in America. Some are just around 80 million people have pre-diabetes. Oftentimes we'll talk about, especially type 2 diabetes, as a lifestyle disease, right? So we put the blame on the person, which is erroneous. The number one thing that dictates your lifestyle is your job. How long does it take you to get to work? What are you doing when you're at work? What are you allowed to eat, or when can you eat? How much does it cost at work? It is incredible how we want to extract companies from the society in which we operate. And I do believe that things like chronic disease could be addressed through how companies are designed, right? So, like, what if every company invested more in people and their health? And that doesn't mean I'm paying for your health care. That's like a first step. Like, that to me is sort of like basic. But like, what if you allowed for exercise? Imagine somebody who has to be to work at 8. Let's say your day is 8 to 5, which is really quite rare today. And you have an hour commute, which means you're leaving your house at 7. Let's say you're a family with 2 kids. Okay. What do you eat? What do your kids eat? How does your kid get to school? How do you get to work? What do you eat? Do you have time to eat? Does your company book through lunch? Which I think every idea they book right through lunch. Okay, you get back in your car. You get home. Okay, now it's 6 o'clock. How much time do you have to make dinner? And what time does your kid go to bed? What time do you go to bed? Do you jump back online? Like, this is a rat race. It's a total rat race that, we sort of sell ourselves this Kool-Aid and drink that Kool-Aid that like we're trying to change the world. And this happens particularly in startups that, I'm working to, not just describe somebody who works like an 8-hour day. What does it look like when you work a 10? Right. And, I think about things like chronic disease, and I think about things like literacy, and I think about social emotional learning and all of these things that whether you're a child or an adult, um, how much work and how we've designed the private sector in particular to operate that affects this. And so the first question is like, well, can you actually change your business and still be profitable? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, you can create more value. And so what we're doing through the Human Company Playbook is conducting a series of interviews of CEOs who embrace this approach. And these CEOs, some of them are public companies, some are early stage companies, some are private. It just spans the gamut, spans industry. And we're trying to uncover the common shared values. What are these core tenets? And how does it play out so that we can give advice to new entrepreneurs as well as other executives as to how they might want to build a more human company and what return looks like, when you can expect that return. And at the end of the day, we're pointing out that there is a choice. There's nothing about business that is written in stone. We as a society chose to organize our work the way we have today, which is actually maybe the scariest part.
No, so what's so interesting about that is when I talk to people about design thinking, one of the things I try to tell them is that everything around them has been designed, which means that that's either been designed well or it's been designed poorly or unintentionally, and that everything around them can be designed with intention. And that goes to the companies that we work in. There are certain choices that have been made based on certain assumptions that can be remade. And it sounds like what you're trying to do is explain to people the impact of these various choices, and that these things that seem extravagant, like not booking through lunch and maybe even buying people lunch, have over time a more positive effect than the sort of short-term gain of let's book more time and let's not spend money on stuff we don't have to spend money on.
Right. I mean, we explicitly chose Friedman's argument over Drucker's, right? And you think of the 80s and, the good Gordon Gekko statement. We chose that. And what's interesting, and not just corporations, but federal government and how we look at, the finance industry, how we look at corporate law, we chose to allow for that to happen and to even foster it. So, every CEO will say, like, my job is to create as much shareholder value as possible under the current law system, right? Which is true, I guess, if that's what your company is designed to do. But when we look at it, and we look at how people in seats of power make decisions, when we think about employee compensation and executive compensation, when we look at, like, the pay gap, we look at healthcare access, like, all these decisions directly contribute to income inequality, right? So, it's like, and I'm not anti-capitalist. I mean, like, I'm a CEO of a private sector company. I also invest in early stage companies, but I do think that one could be more mindful about the distribution, right? So if you're running a profitable company, and I don't care what size it is, and anybody in your company cannot afford to make ends meet, right? So like for like the average size family, then you're probably doing something wrong. and you are contributing to this larger problem of income inequality. What's also really interesting is that the income gap and the wealth gap that we see amongst individuals is also being replicated on the company end of things. So as companies are making more and more money and corporate profits are actually at an all-time high, the distribution is uneven. So top-performing companies outpace the rest, and that creates competitive advantage. And so that's a barrier to competition. And so it really is a winner-take-all model, and that's actually not good for American business. So when you think about S&P companies, the average lifespan of an S&P company today is just 12 years. That should scare people right now.
Yeah.
And so we actually chose to make America as a country rich, so all-time high profits, CEO pay through the roof, but we also chose not to make Americans, like the people, rich. And so the middle class is no longer the majority. And this is all about company design. And when I say company design, it's in tandem with policy.
Yeah.
So a really good book to read if you're interested in this is Makers and Takers. Came out last year. And it talks about the financialization of American business and really breaks it down in a way that even a lay person can understand.
That is fascinating. And we're almost talking about the difference between an extractive relationship and a sustained relationship, and that can go between a company and employees, and also between a company and its users, and just making sure that there's a balanced and sustainable perspective in all those relationships, which is really cool.
Yeah, and but here's the problem. Even though we know that investing more today will yield even more in 10 years, our short-term mindset is just so stuck that we won't do it, right? Sure. So most CEOs don't feel that they have the liberty to invest in the thing that will help them in the long run because there is so much pressure from their board to get done what they need to get done this quarter, this year, next 2 years.
Yes.
And this is very dangerous. I think it is, while I love America's ability to think quickly and be agile and shift and respond to what's happening today, our inability to think about the long term and outcome is going to hurt. It's going to hurt.
Yeah, so I mean, this quarterly capitalism is definitely a challenge. It sounds like you're helping companies kind of look around the corner in a lot of ways. You used the term intelligence engines. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you build an intelligence engine in a company and if it kind of helps some of these challenges that we're talking about.
That's a good question. So I will say that all of our clients do struggle with quarterly capitalism and the long run. It is a perennial challenge that, we have to help them through. So, whether it's communicating to your senior leadership team or to your CEO or to the board, why you might want to make this investment today in something that is a moonshot, that's part of our job. And we do that every day, especially on our strategy side of the business where it's all behind the scenes. Like, you're not going to read about this in the newspaper because it is very contentious and very important, right? Like, you've got a big nut of money, and where do you put it? On the other hand, there are sort of smaller steps that you can take. And so intelligence engines can really be, anything that you produce that touches people collects intelligence, and it can ultimately be used to inform other parts of the business. So whether you are, Jane in interactive advertising or whatever team that touches that, or you're Joe, in clinical trials, if you're collecting information that might have a greater purpose, we have to figure out how to get the data to flow, right? And how to, even more than the data, like share the insights, right? And so that is also a really big challenge for organizations. I often find that the technology, like once you get past the tech hurdle, like, okay, we're going to do this, the bigger problem is always organizational, right? So anybody can build a dashboard, anybody can build an intelligence engine, anybody can build a machine learning team. But what usually helps or hinders the effort is, does the organization circle around it and support it?
And act on it.
Or not.
Right? So what I'm hearing is like, it's not just, one problem is the organization isn't pulling in the intelligence. The second problem is they're not turning that into insight. And then the third would be they're not actually turning it into something that they act on.
Well, or even sharing it across, silos in a team. So, if the example I gave before, the person in interactive marketing and the person in clinical trials might not ever talk.
Yes.
They are in completely different ends of an organization that might have 100,000 employees. Right?
Yeah, totally. So silos.
And when we say silos, it's like people always say, like, oh, yes, the silos. But why do silos exist? It mostly exists because of how we budget. So every year, if you're lucky, somebody's given you goals for the next year, like overarching, like the 3 things our company wants to do in the next 1 to whatever years. And from that, you come up with programs and then the budget to run those programs or those things. In many companies, it's just like, what do you want to do? We'll look at it, and then we'll tell you which pieces you get. And so it always becomes this really awkward fight for budget and control. And, my dream project is someday I would love to help a major organization rethink its budgeting process. I know that is large and lofty, But if there's one thing that companies need to think about, I think it's, well, actually there are three things. So like, how do you budget? How do you hire? And how do you procure? Those three processes are very antiquated, and they, there's also a lot of like legal reasons why they happen the way they happen today that I think they hold America back from really breaking through to the big innovations that will, not just transform their own organization, but their industry at large.
Yeah, so one thing I did want to talk to you about is open innovation, because you guys at Luminary Labs help companies build platforms to pull in a lot of intelligence. It seems pretty quickly. And I was looking at like the EdSim challenge. This is something you guys do, it seems like a fair bit.
Yeah, so 6 years ago, we had a client that wanted to pilot with some early stage companies in the health space. And so we decided to run a prize competition. We'd never done this before. There were models for this, mostly hackathons and like smaller scale challenges, but there were also things like X Prize that we observed. And so we went out and we designed a challenge the Luminary way. We took the best practices of the things that we liked. We sort of rejected some of the other things that we didn't really like. And what we ended up creating was what is known as a multi-stage competition. And what that means is that after everyone submits, a jury will narrow it down to 5 participants who get seed money and then access to a virtual accelerator where there's mentorship, educational modules. There's also an in-person boot camp where they can refine their solutions by having access again to maybe the sponsoring organization or people who might help them fill some of the gaps that they have.
Very cool.
And then it's so much fun, right? It's always fun to give away money. And then the 5 teams present at a demo day, usually a live demo day, and following that, the jury will select a winner. In some cases, the juries will select 2 finalists who get to actually test their prototype in a setting, like a clinical setting, or test it in the field, and then a winner would be selected. So in any case, this is really different from the previous model of enter your idea and we give you money for the best idea. Again, we go back to we like to make it real. So this first prize competition was for a pharmaceutical. It was the first time that a pharmaceutical had done this at such a large scale. The prize purse was $250,000. At the time, we were accused of prize inflation because the prizes at the time were more like $25,000. And we thought we would do this once, and it was a project. It was great. It accomplished the goal. But we did it in such a different way that we started to get phone calls. And so today we have a thriving open innovation practice. In addition to working with the private sector, we also now have government contracts. So we power Ed Prizes for the U.S. Department of Education. That's where you saw the EdSim Challenge, which is asking gamers and VR and AR developers to create simulations that transfer skill sets. So imagine you're a student and you're trying to pick a career path, especially if you're in what's known as career and tech ed. How do you know which direction to go in? What if in a future world, today you can read about these things in books, but what if you could put on a headset and actually try on that job? This is actually being used at places like Caterpillar and hospitals. Ebola training is one of the great examples we talk about where simulations are really important to getting the job done safely. But what if it were on a larger scale? What if it were interoperable, right? So you could go from job to job. So that's what the EdSim Challenge is. We also power challenges for the private sector, as I mentioned before, and foundations. And I think more recently we're seeing a specialization in bringing together a sponsor and a technology company or a particular technology. So when you think about EdSim, it's like education plus VR, AR, and gaming. The Mood Challenge for Research Kit is funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but it's solely focused on Research Kit, which is Apple's open source framework, right? So we're taking, again, 2 different things and bringing them together through the technology. And the latest to be announced, which we're really excited about, it will be launched actually in April, it was announced last month, is the Alexa Diabetes Challenge. So we're going to be calling upon innovators to write skills for Amazon Alexa and its supporting voice technology platform to help people living with diabetes, right? Live their life. And so in this case, you have Merck as a sponsor and Amazon as a partner, and we're squarely focused on voice technology through Alexa. So this is it's a great part of our work. It's not everything we do, but it's probably the most public thing we do, because as I mentioned earlier, anytime you're giving away money, and we've given over $5 million away in the past 5 years, it gets a lot of attention.
That's very cool. So one of the questions I have as a follow-up to that is, in my own experience, companies don't have a lack of ideas. They have a challenge of knowing how to get things out the door. Like, there's too many rules internally inside of the organization that keep teams from launching things that they're excited about. And I'm not saying in any way, shape, or obviously open innovation is important, because sometimes the block is we don't know what's around the corner. But what do you do with your other clients who have that other problem where they don't know how to, that's failure to launch?
Right. So I remember Frida Lewis Hall, who is the chief medical officer and an EVP at Pfizer, at, I think it was the TED-Med conference years ago, quoted her husband, and he said, "Less ideas, more I-doers." And it just really stuck, right? Ideas are great. Everybody has ideas. But real innovation isn't in the idea, it's in the ability to stand it up. And so I think one of the areas where we've been particularly supportive of companies that struggle with the getting it done is breaking it down. So every client of ours has made what I call the $20 million mistake. And whenever I say this, they all think I'm talking about them, but they've all done it. At some point in some executive's career, $20 million was wasted on a program that was a complete flop. And it was because it was done in a waterfall fashion, where it's like, here's the idea. Okay, let's make the idea bigger. Okay, let's build the idea. Let's add on to the idea. And nobody has ever stopped to have sort of stage gates that connect with the people that would be making use of the thing or interacting with the thing. And so early on, we realized that an agile methodology can actually be applied to business as well. So teaching executives, what does it mean to produce a large-scale program in an agile fashion? Before we even get to the technology, if there is technology involved, how do you go? How do you start with design research, and people say, well, that's great for consumer products. I say, yeah, but if you're building something internally, have you talked to the people inside the company that would be using this, right? Yeah. Oftentimes our own internal technologies are the worst, right? Because we don't talk to the own customer, who's the internal person. So start by talking with humans, play devil's advocate, make sure you're managing the possible and not the probable. There's a really good McKinsey article on that called Delighting in the Possible. So most companies end up watering down programs because they want to mitigate risk. And so that's how you very quickly spend $20 million. And then you find out that nobody used it and you shut it, or sunset it, as they like to say, the next year. So
sunsetting makes it sound so lovely and peaceful.
It is, right? Yes, riding off in the sunset. And, the way you avoid the $20 million mistake is to start small. And it doesn't mean that it has to take longer. It might actually be cheaper. It might be more expensive. You don't know, but you will do it smarter. And so that earlier comment I made about budgeting, you can still budget $20 million, but how do you release the funds? What are the expectations? How do you get to where you're going? And that sort of leads us to the culture of failure and being judicious about that. And so it doesn't mean in a very large corporation, no, it's not fail every day all the time.
Yes.
It's fail, learn, do something smarter.
Yes. So
being comfortable that you might, we had a project where we built something that was intended to be taken down. It was a prototype. It was a public, most people didn't know that. It was a publicly facing prototype, and we completely rebuilt it after a year. And again, it was built into the budget. It was built into the design, and there was a purpose. We were collecting information. It was the intelligence engine. And so this idea of standing things up in an agile way it's very consultative. But the second way we do that is we after we come in and we're working on a strategy or innovation program, sometimes we stand the program up for the client. Sometimes we identify partners who can stand up the program. Sometimes we teach staff how to stand it up. And I think that's a really important distinction because every organization is different. Some like to outsource. Some hate to outsource. Some trust their current vendor list. Some don't. Some really don't trust that, but some don't really want to work with their vendor list but have to due to some corporate pressure. And so navigating the conditions for success to actually get something stood up in a company is as important as your plan for standing it up.
Yes.
So if you find out that, a particular partner doesn't have the skill set, but you're being required to make use of that partner, you have to think really cleverly about how to do that.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the, I'm not a fan of secret sauce, but that really is the hard stuff, I guess, in getting the job done.
Well, there's also the mental shift, what you're talking about with this sort of this prototyping mindset. A good friend of mine posted just a couple of days ago the difference between an MVP and an RAT. And an RAT is a riskiest assumption test. And I think sometimes people get caught up in the what's this minimum viable product? And they think it has to be much bigger in order to be able to be testable, instead of finding a way to just test the riskiest part of it as quickly as possible and get that feedback.
I love that. And, I think in our, at the onset of a project in the workshop that we usually produce where, the contract is signed and we get in a room and we say, okay, what are we really talking about? Because oftentimes you don't know during the proposal process, or maybe you've worked with this client for years, and it's not until you're actually in a room together that you realize what's really going on, or people feel safe saying what's really going on. And once you establish that trust, I always call it going to the crazy. It's completely okay to go to the edges and maybe you walk back closer to the center. But if you haven't explored what crazy looks like, you're probably not doing enough, right? So, I was at this really incredible retreat last week where we were asked to imagine how an organization would look, and we went the safe way first, and then we said, okay, forget all of that. What if it looked like this? And we just came up with a crazy idea. And interestingly, there were actually elements of the crazy idea that were not only viable, but will be embraced. So, sometimes going to the crazy isn't about the crazy thing itself, but it's about what is the attribute, the thing that makes that funny or interesting that you can pull through, that might become part of the end solution.
And just harness that part and find a way to ground it. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
So Sara, we're coming up against time. Before we go, I'm just wondering if there's anything I should have asked you that I haven't.
I mean, this was a really lovely conversation, and I really appreciate your time and the questions. Very thoughtful. I think you covered it.
We nailed it. So I can just drop the mic, is what you're saying.
Drop the mic. Yes.
Okay. Well, Sara, thank you very much for your time. It's a delight to talk with you, and I appreciate your insights. The intelligence engine concept is really valuable, and something I'm going to walk away from this for sure. So I really appreciate your time, and I'll send you a follow-up. I'd love to take a look at that McKinsey article on delighting in the possible as well.
Absolutely. I'll send you all the details.
And we're going to leave it right there. Thanks for sticking around. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on iTunes or Google Play. Thanks for your fine attention, and I'll see you next time. And also, I feel like I'm always going to mispronounce your last name. Can you just say it for me real quick?
Holoubek.
Holoubek.
Just like the song, the Holoubek girl is Holoubek.